In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was formless and empty, and waters and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. The second day God said, "Put an expanse between the waters on the earth and the waters above." And God called the expanse sky. On the third day God said, "Let dry ground appear and separate the waters on the earth." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, plants and trees." The land produced plants and trees bearing fruit according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. The fourth day God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to give light on earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the sun to govern the day, and the moon to govern the night. He also made the stars and set them in the expanse of the sky. And God saw that it was good. On the fifth day God said, "Let the waters be filled with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea, and every winged bird according to its kind. And there was evening and there was morning the fifth day. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning the sixth day. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested.
Our world is pretty incredible. As illustrated by that video, which was a dramatic reading of a paraphrase of Genesis chapter 1, it's pretty amazing the world that we live in. And the more that we study the world that we live in, the more amazing it becomes to us. In fact, we have been studying our planet for so long and learning about how amazing it is that scientists have now been turning their attention to the cosmos, to galaxies and solar systems. In fact, there's a whole program right now called the SETI program, where researchers are analyzing radio waves from space to try to see if there is intelligent life in the universe outside of planet Earth. They take millions of random radio signals and they put them through what's called a design filter. It's basically a computer program that tries to detect whether these random sounds have an intelligent cause behind them. And this idea of detecting intelligent cause is a well-established science. It's used by those who do insurance fraud investigation. Was this an accident, or did somebody do it on purpose to try to get an insurance check? Arson detectives do this. Did a building burn down by accident, or did somebody burn it down on purpose? Forensic scientists who do criminal detective work use this kind of design filter. It's well-established science, and it's also used by this SETI program. And after millions of radio waves and decades of research, they have come up with exactly zero evidence for intelligent life in the universe. In fact, it turns out that our planet is a pretty unique place, that there's all these factors that have come together in our solar system and on our planet and in our galaxy that work together to allow life to exist on planet Earth. Discover Magazine recently wrote an article about this, and what they reported is that our planet is so unique that it turns out that it's a 1 in 700 quintillion kind of place. Now, if the number quintillion means nothing to you, like it does to me, then think about this: 1,000, million, billion, trillion, and then you get to quintillion. So our planet is a 1 in 700 quintillion kind of place. Those are the odds that all of the factors would have worked together the way that they did for life to exist on planet Earth. And Discover Magazine concludes the article by saying this: Earth appears to have been dealt a lucky hand. Wow! How lucky of us to have won the 1 in 700 quintillion lottery and be the only intelligent life that we know of so far in the universe. Well, today we're going to continue our series in Genesis chapter 1 through 12, talking about science and its relationship to the Bible, by seeing that this really probably doesn't have anything to do with luck. The probabilities are too immense. The evidence is too clear to chalk this up to sheer time and chance. And what we're going to do today is look at Genesis chapter 1, and we're going to find that Genesis chapter 1 turns out to be an ancient creation account with remarkable modern scientific support. Genesis chapter 1 is an ancient creation account with remarkable modern scientific support. And so we're going to begin in Genesis chapter 1, reading verses 1 through 3. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Now, when we talk about Genesis chapter 1 revealing when we talk about Genesis chapter 1 being an ancient creation account with remarkable modern scientific support, what we're not saying is that modern science is an authority over the Bible, and that if modern science doesn't support the claims of the Bible, that somehow the Bible loses its authority or its credibility. The authority of the Bible does not rest in science or archaeology or other ways to be able to prove the claims of the Bible. The authority of the Bible rests in Jesus Christ, the Word of God, who is the risen one. His resurrection and his status as Son of God is the authority that the Bible rests on. But what I am saying is that if God inspired His Word, if the Bible is God's inspired Scripture, then we shouldn't be surprised if the accounts in the Bible of the natural order and how the world came to be, we shouldn't be surprised if they are compatible with modern science, if we see evidence for them in modern science. And it turns out that Genesis 1 is an ancient creation account with remarkable modern scientific support. And the first thing that we're going to see that supports this is that Genesis chapter 1 reveals a creator that is wholly separate from creation. Genesis chapter 1 reveals a creator that is wholly separate from creation. Genesis, the Bible itself, does not begin with creation. It begins with, "In the beginning, God created." And so what we see in Genesis chapter 1 is a creation that is dependent on a creator. It has a starting point. time, space, matter, all had a beginning and are dependent on a creator according to Genesis chapter 1. Now, here's what's interesting. 70 years ago, if you would have told somebody that time, space, and matter had a beginning point, the way that the Bible says, you would have been told that your view was anti-science, that it did not have scientific support. You see, 70 years ago and before, there was a common belief in what's called the steady state theory of the universe. And the steady state theory of the universe simply said that the universe, time, space, and matter had just always existed eternally. They had just been there forever. And that was a pretty convenient belief for scientists because it removed any need for a creator. If time, space, and matter have just been there forever, then nobody needs to create them. But about 70 years ago, some new ideas began to be revealed in science, completely separate from religion, completely separate from Christianity. Scientists began to see something called Big Bang cosmology. And this is just a little slide that illustrates what the Big Bang teaches, or what this scientific theory is. Big Bang cosmology is the generally accepted theory among scientists that all matter, energy, and even space-time itself originated from one singularity. Let me repeat that again. Big Bang cosmology is the generally accepted theory that all matter, energy, and even space-time itself originated from one singularity roughly 15 billion years ago. So you see, way back here in the beginning, there's a singularity, a tiny, microscopic, just condensed ball of matter explodes, resulting in stars and galaxies and solar systems and planets. And this idea of a Big Bang came about completely separate from anything that Christians were saying about the origin of the universe. In fact, this scientific finding that the universe had a starting point was so unsettling to scientists that they utterly rejected it at first, even though there was a lot of observable science. For example, they could see through telescopes light from stars that they say are billions of years away. So we know how fast light travels, and we can measure the distance between our planet and many of these very distant stars. And so they'll take that distance, and they'll take the speed of light, and they'll say, well, this star is 3 billion light years away from us. I don't understand how all the science works, but what I do understand is that because the light takes so long to reach these telescopes, once it reaches the telescopes, what scientists are looking at, they claim, are actually events that happened way, way back in the past. And what they see way, way back in the past are that galaxies were much closer together. When they use infrared technology to measure the light patterns and the intensity of the brightness, what they find is that the universe was much hotter a long time ago. And then they have things like background radiation and redshift and the cosmological constant with gravity and energy forces, and all these things are fine-tuned together. And this is observable science that supports the Big Bang theory. But even with all that observable science, scientists were so unsettled by the fact that the universe would have a starting point that they utterly rejected it. In fact, this was one of the early physicists who rejected the Big Bang, and he said, the biggest problem with the Big Bang theory is philosophical, perhaps even theological. What was there before the bang? A modern physicist, John Maddox, says, the implication is that there was an instant at which time literally began, and so by extension an instant before which there was no time. That in turn implies that even if the origin of the universe may be successfully supposed to lie in the Big Bang, the origin of the Big Bang itself is not susceptible to discussion. So here's what's got scientists all worked up. If time, space, and matter had a beginning point, that means that there was a time when there was no time, space, and matter. And you can't observe that with science. You can't figure that out with science. And that freaks them out because scientists are there to observe and make claims about the way the world actually is from observable evidence. And so this has freaked scientists out so much that even modern scientists are going back to ancient theories like the oscillating universe, which was a Greek mythology belief that the universe is constantly expanding and contracting forever. So there's infinite Big Bangs happening. Or even though there's no observable science, and even though the math and the theories behind it are really sketchy, they're putting forward this multiverse idea, that there must be infinite universes out there, because in order to get a well-designed world that we have today, in order to get the kind of world we have today, the probability is so small, 1 in 700 quintillion, you'd have to have infinite universes for the probabilities to ever work out. And so they present this multiverse, even though there's no observable science behind it, even though the math and the theoretical side is highly skeptical. They don't want to accept the idea that time, space, and matter had a beginning point. Well, we have to ask ourselves, why is this? Well, what kind of being could create space and time and matter? What kind of being would be necessary to do that? Well, that being would have to be outside of time. That being would have to be not bound by space. That being would have to be immaterial. And so I take you back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. In the beginning, God. A being that is timeless. A being that is outside of space. A being that is immaterial. It turns out that Genesis chapter 1 reveals a creator that is wholly separate from creation, which actually lines up pretty well with what modern science is saying would be necessary to cause something like the Big Bang. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that Big Bang cosmology gives 100% scientific support to the Bible, or that the Bible needs the Big Bang to be in authority. But what I am saying, and try to follow me here, what I am saying is that an ancient creation account written over 4,000 years ago lines up very well with modern scientific discoveries. And so I'll let you draw your own conclusions about that. The second thing that we see is that Genesis chapter 1 reveals a creation that is designed, orderly, and predictable. Genesis chapter 1 reveals a creation that is designed, orderly, and predictable. And we'll begin with this idea of design. We see this portrait of an artist or an architect, however you want to imagine him, this God, this genius creator who is designing all these things for their specific use and purpose. He's speaking them into existence. We see design in Genesis chapter 1. And so we have to ask the question again, do we see design in observable science? Is it something that we see present? Well, let's go back to the Big Bang. Because, again, we're talking about a scientific theory presented not by religious people, but by the scientific community. And the scientific community, completely separate from religious claims, has investigated what the original conditions would have been around the Big Bang. Again, I don't know how they do it. I just know that a lot of them do it, and they test it, and they claim that it's very reliable. And here's one of these scientists, a very famous scientist named Stephen Hawking, who is an atheist. And here's what he says. He says, if the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been less by 1 part in 10 to the 10th power, which again, 10 to the 10th power, quintillion, these numbers don't really make sense to me. So if the Big Bang if the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been less by an infinitesimal amount, right? The universe would have collapsed after a few million years. If it had been greater by 1 part in 10 to the 10th power, the universe would have been essentially empty after a few million years. In neither case would it have lasted long enough for life to develop. What Stephen Hawking is saying is, if you can get to this point, just a few minutes after the Big Bang, scientifically speaking, if the rate of expansion had been just a tiny, tiny bit slower, or just a tiny, tiny bit faster, there would be no life anywhere in the universe. Now, again, numbers like 10 to the 10th power, they kind of lose me at that point. So let me read you another quote by a man named Robert Collins, who explains this. He says, "The odds of the universe expanding at just the right rate are comparable to randomly hurling a dart from outer space and hitting a bullseye on Earth that is less than the size of one atom." That's incredible. And that's just one of the evidences for design in the universe. There are, according to astrophysicist Hugh Ross, over 150 of these fine-tuning facts that are observable by science, that if they would have been just slightly different, there would be no life in the universe or on planet Earth. Now, when scientists are confronted with this, when they see this design, when they see these just unbelievable odds against there being any life in the world and how fine-tuned it is, their commitment to something called philosophical naturalism, which is the belief that there is no God, that all that is real is the physical stuff that we can see and observe and interpret with our senses. Because of their commitment to the idea that there's no God, scientists that see this basically say, well, it appears like it's been designed. It sure looks that way. Well, yeah, it does sure look that way. But they'll say, but it's not that way. It sure looks that way. It sure looks like there's design, but there isn't design. And you kind of pause for a moment and go, what? You're here to look at observable things in the universe, and it looks like there's design, but you're telling me there is no design. Well, here's what they say. They say, well, here's the thing. If the universe had expanded slightly quicker or slightly slower, we would have never existed to even notice. But here we are. So things must have worked out just right for us to be here because we're here to see them. Now, if that kind of logic doesn't make sense to you, it's because it doesn't make sense, okay? I mean, I'm sorry. I don't mean to be dismissive, but if you can see all of this fine-tuning and the appearance of design, and your answer is, well, it must be that way because we're here to see it, you're ignoring vast fields of design detection in, like we said before, in arson investigation, in insurance fraud claim investigation, in copyright, in the SETI program. They all accept that you can start with observable evidence and work your way back to an intelligent designer, but not atheists. They say, no, because we're here, it must have just been this way. And I'll say this, if we were talking about, maybe one or two of these kinds of coincidences, maybe that would make a little more sense. But again, astrophysicist Hugh Ross says there are over 150 examples of this kind of cosmic fine-tuning in the universe and on our planet. And so we have to really think about how improbable that would be, that all of these things would just so happen to line up for rational beings such as ourselves to not only exist, but have the mind and the mental capacity to observe these things. I think it's beyond credulity to say that, well, it just happens to be that way because we're here to see it. But let me share an illustration with you from another cosmologist, a man named John Leslie, who talks about just how absurd this kind of argument is. Because maybe you're here today and you've heard that and you thought, actually, that kind of makes sense. Well, let me give you this illustration from this just cosmologist. You're in South Korea. You're on vacation. Right now, the Olympics are happening in South Korea. And you're there, and you somehow accidentally wander into North Korea. And you're arrested, and you're convicted of espionage. You're a spy. And you're sentenced to death. And I want you to imagine you walk into a courtyard and you stand in front of a brick wall and 50 trained marksmen stand 15 feet away from you and they raise their high-powered rifles and the commander yells, "Ready, aim, fire!" And you close your eyes and you brace yourself, and the next thing you hear is the roar of 50 high-powered rifles firing in unison. And then after a moment, you realize you're still alive. You open your eyes and you realize that not a single bullet has hit you. Now, I suppose in that moment you could say to yourself, well, of course I'm alive. If any of the bullets had hit me, I would be dead. I suppose you could think that and you could just be on your way. But I don't think that would be a very satisfying conclusion when you were just 15 feet away from 50 trained marksmen with high-powered rifles. You would probably wonder, what was the reason that they all missed? Did somebody tamper with their rifles? Did they want to rebel against their commander? Did they all believe that I was innocent? Surely the answer must be something other than they all missed me from 15 feet away, because that's just too improbable. And it's the same improbability when we think about the design and the fine-tuning in our universe. The overwhelming amount of design in the universe points to a creator who designed this world to function the way it does. And here's the thing. If all we had was evidence from the fine-tuning of the universe, I think that would be enough for us to come to the conclusion that there must be a designer behind this. There must be a creator who put all this together. But the beautiful thing is that this design, this intricacy, does not just exist in the vastness of the cosmos, but we also observe it at the tiniest microscopic level here on planet Earth. This next slide is a picture of a single-cell organism called E. coli. E. coli is something that will make you very, very sick. But it's a very simple single-cell organism. And when Darwin came up with this theory of evolution, the understanding of cells was very immature. They kind of thought of cells as these little lumps of protoplasm. And so the idea that the cell could evolve by natural methods with enough time and enough chance, it wasn't that big of a leap. But we know a lot more about cells today. In fact, this quote tells us just how much we know. We know now that even the simplest functional cell is almost unfathomably complex, containing at least 250 genes and their corresponding proteins, each one extraordinarily difficult to produce randomly, and none of which can function apart from the intricate structure of the cell. Each tiny microscopic cell is made up of millions of molecules, contains over 250 different genes with corresponding proteins, all created to function together in harmony at the microscopic level, just in a single cell. Not to mention the human body, not to mention ecology and the way that the world works in harmony, but at the microscopic level. And it gets even more incredible than this. This next slide is a picture from a textbook at the University of Oregon State. This is from a textbook at Oregon State University, a secular university. And this is a component, just one component of an E. coli cell. It's called the bacterial flagellum. And this is literally a microscopic outboard motor that exists in the E. coli cell that powers the E. coli cell and drives it through water and through the interior of our body. You notice it has a stator, it has a P-ring and a rod and an L-ring, it has a hook and a little propeller that twirls around and causes it to move. This is a video of the bacterial flagellum in action. This is from secular science. They've discovered this. And again, they say that, well, it sure appears that this bacterial flagellum was designed, but we're supposed to believe that it wasn't designed. We're supposed to believe that with enough time and enough chance, this little microscopic motor inside of a microscopic E. coli single-cell organism somehow just popped into existence. Genesis chapter 1 reveals a creation that is designed, orderly, and predictable. And so when we see this kind of design, at the highest levels of the universe, at the tiniest microscopic levels on earth, what conclusion should we draw? That this is the result of random time and chance, or of a powerful and intelligent creator? I'll let you decide. We also see order in the universe in Genesis chapter 1. We see order. There's an incredible structure in Genesis 1 that shows the order of creation. We see God separating out the things that don't belong together and then filling these things in the different days of creation. He separates light from darkness. He separates the water and the sky. He separates the water on the earth from the land and creates the dry ground. We see God separating things that don't belong together. Then he begins to fill them in. He fills the sky in with the stars and the sun and the moon. He fills the water in with fish and sea creatures. He fills the air with birds. He fills the land with plants and with animals and with people. And so we see this incredible order in creation. We see that God is the God that separates and fills. And this would have had a powerful impact on the ancient Israelites that first received this creation account, because God was leading them into a hostile territory with very wicked people. And God was going to separate these evil and wicked people from their land. And he was going to fill that land with his people, the proper inhabitants. And God had called this people to be separate from the idolatry of the Canaanites, to be separate from sin, and to be filled with his word and his purpose. And so sure enough, they see in creation a God of order, a God who separates and fills. And we also see this in the way that God makes and defines creation. 3 different times he speaks of plant life and water creatures and birds and land animals being made after their kind. And of course we see this in science today, that there are different species of animals that can't breed together. And while these different species are different, they contain a lot of the same components. In fact, before Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution, natural scientists saw this similarity between species as evidence of a creator. So for example, the manatee, if you go out to Manatee Park, they've got all these diagrams, and you see that one of the appendages of a manatee, they compare it with the human wrist. And you can see a lot of similarity in the bone structure of the wrist and the human hand and the flipper, the appendage of the manatee. And before Darwin, scientists said, well, this is evidence of a creator who had different templates of design. I mean, think about a cabinet maker, for example. A cabinet maker is going to have a lot of different kinds of hinges, a lot of different kinds of cabinets and facing on the cabinets, but not an infinite number. And so you'll see similarity in the design of different types of cabinets. You see different similarity in different species of creatures, because God is a God of order. And he created the world with order. He also made the world very predictable. Listen to verses 14 and 15 of Genesis chapter 1. God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. And let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth." And it was so. The sun rises and sets every day. For thousands of years, travelers have been able to count on the stars to navigate and guide them in the right direction, whether by ship or by land. Now here in Florida, I know that we only have 2 seasons. We have hot and perfect, right? Hot and wet and perfect. But in other places, they have multiple seasons. They have winter and spring and summer and fall. And the seasons are predictable. I mean, think about how much trust you would have to have in the predictability of the world to be a farmer in the ancient world. To have to raise up animals, to share your food with them, to hook them up to primitive equipment, to dig out the ground and hand remove rocks and hand plant seeds. How much faith would you have to have in the predictability of the world to believe that those seeds would sprout roots with the right amount of water and sun, and then months later would grow and you could harvest them? You had to have a lot of faith in the predictability of the world to be a farmer in the ancient world. They didn't have the kind of control that we have now, even though a lot of that is an illusion of control. And here's the thing. In the ancient world, this belief that everything was designed and orderly and predictable, it was not the norm. In fact, most of the ancient world saw the universe as a very chaotic place, as a very dark and disturbing place. Most of their mental energy was actually spent on the non-physical world, because the physical world was so intimidating to them and unpredictable and chaotic. The physical world was governed by the gods, and if the god of rain was defeated, it might not rain for years on end, and it was very dark and mysterious. It wasn't until the church established universities and established the idea that the world was a predictable place, designed and orderly, that the natural sciences really took off. And it wasn't only the church, but the church was the primary impetus to fertilize the soil of thought to produce modern science. Genesis chapter 1 reveals a creation that is designed, orderly, and predictable. And finally, Genesis chapter 1 reveals a creation that is filled with purpose. We see in Genesis chapter 1 that everything has a place, everything has a purpose. One of the casualties of philosophical naturalism, the idea that all that is real is physical stuff, that there's no creator, that everything that exists is the result of chance and a lot of time. One of the main casualties of that kind of worldview has been the belief that life has meaning and purpose, that there is an origin beyond the physical world, that there's a foundation for meaning and morality and purpose and a sense of destiny. That's been one of the main casualties of philosophical naturalism in the world. And one of the ways that atheists who teach evolution try to remove the sense of purpose of creation is they'll say, well, look at your tailbone. Your tailbone is useless. It's a leftover from some previous life form millions of years ago that we evolved from that had a tail, and that tailbone is actually evidence that we evolved from some lower form, and it has no purpose. That's not true, actually. It was believed for a long time, and it's still repeated a lot because, as I said, a lie can travel around the world before truth can get out of bed, right? But the tailbone, actually, it's been found has incredible purpose. There's all kinds of muscles and tendons that connect at the tailbone. I actually had problems with my tailbone once. It was out of alignment or something. It was causing me a lot of pain. I had a special thing for my chair to sit in. This was about 5 years ago. And I went and saw a physical therapist, and through ultrasound therapy and massage therapy, they were able to realign my tailbone, and it relieved a ton of pain. The tailbone actually turns out to have a lot of purpose. Let's say this about the appendix. The appendix is a vestigial organ. It has no purpose. It's a holdover from evolution. Well, they found that's not true. The appendix actually is vital to our immune system. God created the world with purpose. He created us with purpose. We have an origin in God. We have meaning to life. We have a purpose and an eternal destiny. And whether or not we believe that has huge implications for what we believe about the intrinsic value of life. It has huge implications for issues like abortion or physician-assisted suicide or how we define marriage and how we define sexual ethics and how we view work, where we land in terms of our interpretation of where the universe came from, and whether or not it just appears to be designed or whether it really was created. There's huge implications here. We're actually going to spend the entire next 2 weeks just talking about the purpose of creation and our relationship as people and God's purpose for creating human beings. That's what we're going to talk about the next 2 weeks. It's such an important concept that it's so important to push back on some of the false claims in our culture that there is no purpose to the world, that it's just the result of random time and chance. We're going to talk about that over the next couple weeks. But I want to talk about purpose here for just a little bit more. And I want to conclude our time together by talking about the best part of this. The best part of this whole conversation about creation and design and meaning and order and predictability. I want to talk about something that far surpasses these things in greatness. Last week, we talked about Psalm 19 and about Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, and how both of these verses talk about how the created order tells us things about God. The heavens declare the glories of God. The created world tells us things about the invisible nature of God. And we talked about how incredible it is that by observing nature, we can actually know things about God. And the truth is that if all we had was this evidence for design and order and purpose, if that's all we had, I think that would be enough to tell us a lot about God, at least to humble us before the presence of a creator. But it's so much better than this. Because God didn't just give us nature as a witness. He gave us so many other witnesses, including Revelation, including the Bible. But hear me, even the Bible isn't the best part. Let me tell you what the best part is. Turn over to the Gospel of John, chapter 1. John chapter 1. To another statement about the beginning. Genesis 1 talks about the beginning of the created world, but John chapter 1 talks about a beginning that far preceded Genesis 1. And in John chapter 1, starting in verse 1, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. And the Word that was in the beginning with God, the Word that created all things, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen His glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." Let me tell you the best part. The best part is that even though God created the world with design, with purpose, with order, with predictability, even though He created the world to be dependent on Him, and even though the people that He created rebelled against Him, even though these people to this day, by the millions, will look at all this design in the universe and say it just appears to be designed, even though we sinned and plunged His creation into ruin, God, the one who is outside of time, the one who is not bound by space, the one who is immaterial, took on flesh, came to live in His creation, dwelt among us in the person of Jesus Christ, lived the perfect life that we could never live, subjected Himself to the brutality of death by execution on a cross to pay the price for sin that we should have to pay, and then was risen from the dead to welcome us into new life in Him if we would turn from our sins, confess our guilt, and believe that He is the Savior who came and died for us and was risen from the dead. The creator of the world, the creator of the cosmos, stepped into His creation so that we could have a relationship with Him. He created us not just for any purpose, but for the purpose of being known by Him and to know Him, to be loved by Him and to love Him. That's the best part. That's the invitation today. Not to be overwhelmed with awe simply at the design of the universe at the cosmic level, all the way down to an E. coli cell and a bacterial flagellum. It's not just to be awed by that, It's to be awed by the reality that that Creator knows us and loves us and sent His Son for us, and that we can respond today in faith to receive Him as our Savior and Lord, to be given meaning and purpose